Hello everyone, this is lesson 4. In this lesson, we will learn how global markets work and winners, losers, and net gains from trade. Because we trade with people in other countries, the goods and services that we can buy and consume are not limited by what we can produce. The goods and services that we buy from other countries are our imports, and the goods and services that we sell to people in other countries are our exports. Global trade today is enormous. In 2011, global exports and imports were $22 trillion, which is one-third of the value of global production. The United States is the world's largest international trader and accounts for 10% of the world exports and 13% of world imports. Germany and China, which rank second and third behind the United States, lag by a large margin. In 2011, our total US exports were $2.1 trillion, which is about 14% of the value of US production. Total US imports were $2.7 trillion, which is about 18% of total expenditure in the United States. We trade both goods and services. In 2011, exports of services were about one-third of total exports, and imports of services were about one-fifth of total imports. Comparative advantage is a fundamental force that drives international trade. Comparative advantage is a situation in which a person can perform an activity or produce a good or service at a lower opportunity cost than anyone else. This same idea applies to nations. We can define national comparative advantage as a situation in which a nation can perform an activity or produce a good or service at a lower opportunity cost than any other nation. The opportunity cost of producing a t-shirt is lower in China than in the United States. So, China has a comparative advantage in producing t-shirts. The opportunity cost of producing an airplane is lower in the US than in China. So, the US has a comparative advantage in producing airplanes. Because China has a comparative advantage at producing t-shirts and the US has a comparative advantage at producing airplanes, the people of both countries can gain from specialization and trade. China can buy airplanes from the US at a lower opportunity cost than that at which Chinese firms can produce them. And Americans can buy t-shirts from China for a lower opportunity cost than that at which US firms can produce them. Also, through international trade, Chinese producers can get high prices for their t-shirts and Boeing can sell airplanes for higher prices. Both countries gain from international trade. Let's now illustrate the gains from trade that we have just described by studying demand and supply in the global markets for t-shirts and airplanes. The US imports t-shirts because the rest of the world has a comparative advantage in producing t-shirts. Figure 7.1 illustrates how this comparative advantage generates international trade and how trade affects the price of a t-shirt and the quantities produced and bought. The demand curve DUS and the supply curve SUS show the demand and supply in the US domestic market only. The demand curve tells us the quantity of t-shirts that Americans are willing to buy at various prices. The supply curve tells us the quantity of t-shirts that US garment makers are willing to sell at various prices, that is, the quantity supplied at each price when all t-shirts sold in the US are produced in the US. Figure 7.1a shows that the US t-shirt market would be like with no international trade. The price of a shirt would be $8 and 40 million shirts a year would be produced by US garment makers and bought by US consumers. Figure 7.1b shows the market for t-shirt with international trade. Now the price of a t-shirt is determined in the world market, not the US domestic market. The world price of a t-shirt is less than $8, which means that the rest of the world has a comparative advantage in producing t-shirts. The world price line shows the world price at a $5 a shirt. The US demand curve DUS tells us that at a $5 a shirt, Americans buy 60 million shirts a year. The US supply curve SUS tells us that at $5 a shirt, US garment makers produce 20 million t-shirts a year. To buy 60 million t-shirts, when only 20 million are produced in the US, we must import t-shirts from the rest of the world. The quantity of t-shirts imported is 40 million a year. Figure 7.2 illustrates international trade in airplanes. The demand curve DUS and the supply curve SUS show the demand and supply in the US domestic market only. The demand curve tells us the quantity of airplanes that US airlines are willing to buy at various prices. The supply curve tells us the quantity of airplanes that US aircraft makers are willing to sell at various prices. Figure 7.2a shows that the US airplane market would be like with no international trade. The price of an airplane would be $100 a million, and 400 airplanes a year would be produced by US aircraft makers and bought by US airlines. Figure 7.2b shows the US airplane market with international trade. Now the price of an airplane is determined in the world market, and the world price is higher than $100 million, which means that the United States has a comparative advantage in producing airplanes. The world price line shows the world price at $150 million. The US demand curve DUS tells us that at $150 million up an airplane, US airlines buy 200 airplanes a year. The US supply curve SUS tells us that at $150 million an airplane, US aircraft makers produce 700 airplanes a year. The quantity produced in the US, 700 a year, minus the quantity purchased by US, 200 a year, is the quantity of airplanes exported, which is 500 airplanes a year. You will learn why producers complain about cheap foreign imports, but consumers of imports never complain. We measure the gains and losses from imports by examining their effects on consumer surplus, producer surplus, and total surplus. In the importing country, the winners are those whose surplus increases, and the losers are those whose surplus decreases. Figure 7.3a shows what consumer surplus and producer surplus would be with no international trade. In t-shirts, US domestic demand DUS and US domestic supply SUS determine the price and quantity. The green area shows consumer surplus and the blue area shows producer surplus. Total surplus is the sum of consumer surplus and producer surplus. Figure 7.3b shows how these surpluses change when the US market opens to imports. The US price falls to the world price, the quantity bought increases to the quantity demanded at the world price, and consumer surplus expands from A to the larger green area A plus B plus D. The quantity produced in the United States decreases to the quantity supplied at the world price, and producer surplus shrinks to the smaller blue area C. Part of the gain in consumer surplus, the area B, is a loss of producer surplus, a redistribution of total surplus, but the other part of the increase in consumer surplus, the area D, is a net gain. This increase in total surplus results from the lower price and increased purchases, and is the gain from imports. We measure the gains and losses from exports just like we measure those from imports by their effect on consumer surplus, producer surplus, and total surplus. Figure 7.4a shows the situation with no international trade. Domestic demand DUS and domestic supply SUS determine the price and quantity, the consumer surplus, and the producer surplus. Figure 7.4b shows how the consumer surplus and producer surplus change when the good is exported. The price rises to the world price, the quantity bought decreases to the quantity demanded at the world price, and the consumer surplus shrinks to the green area A. The quantity produced increases to the quantity supplied at the world price, and the producer surplus expands to the blue area B plus C plus D. Part of the gain in producer surplus, the area B, is a loss in consumer surplus, a redistribution of the total surplus, but the other part of the increase in producer surplus, the area D, is a net gain. This increase in total surplus results from the higher price and increased production and is the gain from exports. This is all from this part. Thank you so much for listening.